I'd like to introduce Bob Doman, founder and director of the National Association for Child Development. We're going to be talking about the link between cognition, language, maturity, and behavior in those of ASD and how to address it. Welcome, Bob.
Good to be here, Kristen. How are you doing?
Really good. When did you begin working with children with autism spectrum disorder?
I'm a little hesitant to say how long I've been doing this. I started in the late 60s and started as a special education teacher for a United Cerebral Palsy organization. And then at the tender age of 25, because of the work I was doing, I became the clinical director of the agency and directed the therapists and teachers for about 250 kids in our school and about 100 kids on home-based programs. So it's been a while.
So you were doing this before most of us, before it became popular and before most of us really even heard the word autism.
Well, sadly, before many of you were born. So it's been a long time. So I've been able to, watch what's happened and what hasn't happened, through quite a few decades.
Now, back in the late 60s and early 70s, how was autism viewed and treated?
It sadly was viewed back then as primarily childhood schizophrenia. So it was viewed as a psychiatric issue. And as such, what treatment there was psychiatric treatment, which essentially is drugs. And then in the later 60s, more behavior modification approaches started coming in.
Well, and how did you view autism back then, and how did you treat it differently?
Well, back at that time, my perspective was based largely on how I grew up, which was my father was a physiatrist, which is an MD specializing in rehabilitation. And if you will, neuroplasticity was one of our primary subjects of discussion when I was a kid. And so I tended to look at things from a neurological perspective and also attempting to view things relative to, okay, how can we trigger neuroplasticity and change the function? But at the same time, we didn't really have a good understanding of what the underlying neurological issues were to know what to address. So it was tough.
Well, in the early 70s, you guys formed and established a groundbreaking new perception of autism. What happened?
An associate of mine, Carl Delicato, a clinical psychologist, and we had quite a team back then. My father, the physiatrist, Carl, we had a team of neurologists and neurosurgeons. And Carl was the first one who understood that the underlying issue in autism is sensory dysfunction. And, people today can't imagine what a big deal that was, opening that door and understanding that the abnormal behaviors were primarily a reflection of abnormal perception produced by abnormal sensory dysfunction. So that was, a gargantuan door that opened and really started changing perception.
And why did you start the National Association for Child Development?
I started NACD in 1979, and at that, in the mid-70s, I was actually living in Spain trying to create some new model programs in Spain. I was working with some organizations in Israel, and I had a few different organizations around the United States where I was designing programs, so I was kind of jumping all over the world at the time. And families I was working with really pushed me to start NACD because they thought there was a huge need to provide more of a holistic, comprehensive, neurologically based program for families to utilize. That just was, and unfortunately today there's still not a lot out there that really is helping to to address what's wrong and working directly with families.
Well, now, what has changed or developed in your understanding to the autism spectrum disorder since then?
It's a process, and I think fortunately I can say, we're learning something almost daily, and we understand a piece, and that opens the door to understanding another piece, and it's a progression. We started off with understanding, okay, we have sensory dysfunction. All right, then we had to try to identify what those various forms of sensory dysfunction were, which is not too easy. Essentially, you look at the child's behavior, and based on their behavior, you try to, if you will, crawl into their heads and see, okay, he must be perceiving this way to be acting that way. And so we had to look at all of the sensory channels and see how all of those sensory channels were broken, if you will, and distorted the input. And then when we, as we looked at more and more individuals, we saw there were more and more differences between those various sensory issues. One size did not fit all, still does not fit all. So we had to understand that individual. Then we had to start trying to develop methodologies to normalize the sensory function. And that's an ongoing, process. For example, in the auditory area, we understood that kids had auditory sensory issues relative to tonal processing. All right, they didn't hear all frequencies of sound correctly. And back at that time, I discovered through my work in Europe with Dr. Doman in Paris, and worked with Dr. Doman and sent kids over from the States. And then based from his work, there were some other work that developed, and we utilized those techniques and methodologies. We utilized programs coming out of Germany, found out none of them were doing quite what we thought was needed, and developed the perception and developed the listening program, and I've since developed some targeted sound intervention programs. So it's on and on and on, trying to get a better handle on what the problems are and how to treat those sensory problems. Then when we looked at beyond the sensory problems, say, okay, what does that do to the overall development of the child? We see, if you will, you learn through your senses. And if we have sensory dysfunction, we have poor sensory input and distorted sensory input, and that creates global problems in development. If you will, it's everything from how the child perceives, food in his mouth, and what things taste like, and what is edible and what's not edible. And we have issues with the child's enhanced peripheral vision and diminished central vision. So that, the old thing, looking at kids on the spectrum as having a psychiatric problem was largely from their visual issue. The perception was, the children were cold and separated and did not make contact and were not emotional because they didn't make good eye contact. They didn't make good eye contact because they didn't have good central vision. And if you don't have good central vision, you don't do those things. And if you don't have good central vision, you're not learning from those things in your environment as you should be. So the sensory issues create problems with global development, and specifically then you get problems with what's called the development of the cognitive function. So we have those issues. Then we have the issues with the language because we don't have the cognition, we don't have the conceptual auditory thinking, vocal thinking. We have an imbalance between the child's thought process being primarily visualization, thinking in pictures rather than thinking in words. So you end up with this huge mountain of issues that all stem from the basic perceptual sensory issues. So it becomes a pretty major issue. If you will, back in the 60s and 70s, when we were trying to work with this, about all we had was behavior modification, operant conditioning. The thought was, okay, we don't really know what's going on, so we're going to attempt to teach skills. And sadly, for most of our children today, most of what they get is skill training, as opposed to trying to address what the underlying problems are, and, if you will, fix the underlying problems.
Well, what I love about your program and really how you teach and how you explain is that, our kids are highly capable, and yet, we're still being told, and we're, 2016, right? We're still being told today that our children won't be able to ever do this or won't be able to ever do that. And what I love about what you're talking about is looking at all of those underlying reasons and then figuring out how to really kind of repair that or, help that child at any age figure out how to move forward. Now, you've been at the forefront of understanding and treating autism spectrum disorder. Why do you see it as a neurodevelopmental disorder? Can you explain the significance of that?
Well, it is a neurodevelopmental disorder, which essentially means it's not a disease. It is a problem that originates from some dysfunction that has a snowball effect on all kinds of function. And essentially, if you will, it's a problem with development, and it's a problem with brain development. And when we perceive it as such, and we understand that the foundation of brain development is neuroplasticity, which means essentially the brain grows and develops based on the input it receives. So if we perceive it's a neurodevelopmental problem and we understand the huge power of neuroplasticity, that essentially says what we need with that individual is to provide them with the specific appropriate input with sufficient frequency, intensity, and duration, and change their brain. And all brains change. How they change is determined by the input they receive. Okay, so perceiving kids on the spectrum as having a neurodevelopmental disorder, if you will, makes it totally open to change. I get in trouble with people because I say, we have kids who are full-blown autistic kids who are now typical. And they say, oh, you can't do that. Autistic kids can't become typical. Yes, they absolutely can. If we have the opportunity to address their issues, provide them with the right input, if you will, put their pieces together.
And every child's different, and it doesn't really matter the age, right?
Every child is different. Absolutely, every child is different. One of my pet peeves relative to what's happening with our kids out there is that people create a thing, and generally it's a fairly narrow thing, and that narrow thing is their program. And if 1,000 people go there, they get 1,000 get that program. And what tends to happen with that is they see that thing as the cure. That thing is the treatment. And the very nature of that is extremely limiting. I think our list of different methodologies we use today is over 3,000. And we're constantly, there's not a week goes by that we're not changing something, modifying something, developing something else because we find the need. The kids absolutely have to be perceived as unique, not perceived as their label, not perceived as part of a group, but perceived as unique individuals in their unique situations. The foundation of our work is the family, and working through the family, and training and educating the family, and providing the family with the tools they need. every family situation is different. So we have kids who are all different, situations are all different, all requiring different things at different times and being addressed in different ways. There is no one way, no one thing that is going to come close to doing what we need to do.
And what I love about your philosophy and how you teach is that you really tailor it to the specific needs of that child. And even you might tailor it, for the first maybe a couple weeks or a month or 2 months, 3 months. But if something's not working, then you kind of say, okay, well, that's not working. Let's now switch it up, and now let's try to figure out another way to figure out to have the same, you still have the same goal and you want to have a better outcome, where there's so many other therapies out there that there's only one way to do it. And if your child doesn't respond to that one way to do it, it's like you're kind of hitting your head against the wall saying, I don't know what to do. Because
I have been lecturing for 40 years to educators and therapists and telling them that generally not only are your specific methodologies wrong, your delivery system is totally wrong. And for example, typically, if you have a child on the spectrum, they receive some physical therapy, they receive some speech therapy, they receive some occupational therapy, they may receive some educational work. But the therapies generally are going to be delivered once or twice a week for about a half hour. All right. Now, I'm sorry, but the brain doesn't develop that way. Back to neuroplasticity, specific input with sufficient frequency, intensity, and duration. Assuming we did something correct to properly stimulate the brain, as soon as we stop that input, it begins to fade from the brain. And if we don't come back in a very short period of time and do it again, we keep losing. We keep up and down to advance, to really use neuroplasticity and change the brain. We have to keep coming in with that specific input. And the more specific it is, the greater impact it's going to have. So we'll design a program. We start a family on a program, and we're getting feedback. And if 2 weeks looking at a video of how something's being done or hearing how the child's responding, it's not appearing to be specific enough, we modify it. And we modify it until we get it. And educationally, for our kids, again, it needs to be specific, it needs to be individual.
And I think that's what's lacking in a lot of different things out there. And I think it was you that I was talking to once before, and we were talking about different therapies, and if the therapist says, coat on, coat on, coat on, if the child doesn't know it's cold outside, then, yes, he can put the coat on, but do we want he or she to put the coat on when it's 80 degrees outside? Do we want that child to understand that I go get my coat when it's cold outside, and so, there's commands and there's understanding of, what someone's requesting of you. And so that's what I definitely like about your program, is it's really, it's building those building blocks that I think are really lacking in a lot of other things people are doing with their kids.
Well, sadly in the field, I've been working on building cognition throughout my career. And part of building cognition is building short-term memory and working memory. And short-term memory and working memory is something that develops at birth, starting from birth. And it develops through input and stimulation, again, specific input and stimulation. Sadly, up until recently, the majority of neuroscientists would not acknowledge that you can change short-term and working memory, which I had always found phenomenally amazing that anyone could think such a thing, because if something develops, it can be changed. It changes. Okay? So, if you will, the foundation of building cognition is short-term memory, working memory, see auditory, visual, sequential processing. All right, and when we have a child with sensory issues, where the brain's getting lousy input, that doesn't develop. And in order to develop cognition, we have to target and develop short-term memory and working memory and build that up incrementally through a lot of different pieces. All right, again, what has historically been done with our kids, if anything, is skill-based. We're going to teach the kid to put his coat on and take it off. All right, but if you don't build the cognition, you're right. He doesn't know when to put the coat on or take it off. If you will, I'd rather have cognition any day than a kid who's great at putting his coat on and taking it off.
Absolutely, so, I agree.
And in truth, once you build the cognition, that thing that you spent 3 months trying to teach, you can teach in 3 minutes.
And I have a great example. My son, we were struggling with potty training for years and years, and it was because he wasn't quite understanding, or it wasn't processing, and I couldn't figure out how to teach him. And every book I bought, every toy I bought, every game we tried to play, you name it, we tried it. And as he started to understand the world around him a little bit better, it was as though he was like, "Oh, you want me to go potty on the potty? Okay." And literally, it was within the first day he walked in there and just went to the bathroom. And I don't think he's ever had one accident. If it was, maybe only one, and I don't even remember it since then. And once he figured it out, once he understood what we were requesting and what we were asking, it was like this little light bulb kind of switched in his head. And it didn't matter how much therapy we did. It didn't matter how many books we read to him, it was as though he couldn't grasp it. And so I like what you're saying is that if they don't understand that it's cold outside, they're not going to grab their coat. If they don't understand that they need to use the bathroom and go potty in the potty, you can throw everything at them, but they have to be able to have the cognition to be able to grasp what you're trying to help them with.
Yep. To make that kind of graphic, at birth, your sequential processing is 0. Okay. Most adults, their sequential processing is about a 7. Now, what that means is your average adult, you could say to them a 6 or 7 digit number at about 1 second intervals. So like at 7, 9, 8, 3, 0, 2, 5, and they could repeat it. Now, for the typical person walking around the planet, it takes about 15 years to get from that 0 to that 7. Sadly, it generally doesn't go much above that, and after you're in your late 20s, it actually begins to decline unless you're doing something special about it. But that development from that 0 to that 7 is really the foundation of what you take in, your complexity of thought, and your function. Okay? So talk about huge. This is about as huge as you get in terms of how any of us walking around the planet function. Now, look at our kids with sensory dysfunction. All right, they're starting off at a 0, which means they don't understand anything. The baby doesn't understand anything. They're trying to start taking in information through their senses and making sense of that information. Well, if you have sensory dysfunction, you've got garbage information. And as the computer people have been saying for decades, garbage in, garbage out. All right, so the whole developmental process, starts slowing down. Now, some of our kids, the issues don't rear up a lot until they're about 2, and development can be fairly typical up until that point. Some of the kids, it's right from the get-go. Okay, but what happens is because of the poor information being processed by the brain, they don't put the pieces together. Now, for a typical child, a 1-year-old child can process generally one piece of information. And if you will, kids who are a year old are easy kids to deal with. All right, you can give them something, they're happy, you take it away, they don't much care, because all they can process is one thing at a time. Also, at that stage of a 1, you get some sounds coming out, and you might get an initial word or two that comes out spontaneously. And it comes out spontaneously, because they've heard it 10,000 times. When they can sequence 2 pieces of information, we take a dramatic neurodevelopmental step forward. Because when they can understand 2 pieces would be like being able to say to your child, touch your nose and your ear. Okay, stand up, clap your hands. When they can sequence 2, that means they can think in 2 pieces. That means they can their language starts to develop. You see, you get a lot more functional 1 words. You get then, as they proceed through those 2s, you get couplets, 2 words put together. You get initial 3-word phrases. Okay? And you get terrible 2 behavior. All right? Which is, terrible 2 behavior is simply a reflection of complexity of thought. All right, so 2 behavior, terrible 2s, our complexity of thought is I want or don't want. It's as far as you go. You don't get a but in there. Okay? So that's why you see kind of, if you will, with 2-year-olds and kids who are neurodevelopmentally 2s, this really difficult behavior where you get these screaming fits and you get these tantrums and you can't deal with it. Also at 2, if you work at it and you take your child to the bathroom every half hour, you will have some success at getting them to perform. When we get to a 3, sequencing 3, things change again rather dramatically. Complexity of thought takes another jump. Now at the 3, you're going to get some 3, 4, and even very initial 5-word sentences coming out. The longer ones are going to be more rote sentences. The child is really starting to be able to perceive and understand a lot more of what's going on around them. Okay, and generally at 3, you can toilet train them and have them start initiating it. But all these pieces go together. It's all complexity of thought. It's all cognition. And it's all things that we can work on. We can push that cognition. All right, but when we work on our programs, a good chunk of what we do from different directions is pushing that cognition, pushing the sequential.
That's the foundation of the cognition that you're talking about. What's the link between that and the language?
Well, the link between that and the language is simply how many pieces of information you can hold together in your brain.
Okay.
Okay, so, if you can hold 2 pieces together, you can put 2 words together. Okay? And kind of what happens with the language, for example, 2s, you get things like hi, mom. Okay? And you get the hi or I want, and those kind of chunk together. And then as you proceed along, you get modifications. I want this, I want that, where the I want is one piece and that other thing is a second piece. For the 2, you're not going to get, Mom, may I please have another drink of water? Okay? All right? Kid doesn't have anywhere near enough pieces for that. All right? If you're lucky, you got Mom, water. Mom, drink. I want drink. All right? So there's a direct correlation between how many pieces of information you can process it, which is what you understand of what's being said, how many pieces of information you can hold together in your mind, and what you can do with it. So this is huge. And sadly, what's happening to most of our kids is that the people working with our kids have no clue about this stuff and are trying to work at skills that are not appropriate for the level of processing.
Well, when you're looking at the cognition and the language, and I think that the way you just summed it up, it was so easy to understand because most of us have been around, children when they're developing at a normal rate, and the 1-year-old or the 2-year-old, would say, especially the 2-year-old would say, more drink or something to that nature.
Yeah.
Now, what about when you're looking at maturity and the behavior and the cognition? How do we kind of put all those together? How are all those linked together?
Well, your behavior is a reflection of your thought patterns. How many, if you will, we primarily think in words. And our cognition is mostly based on words, which creates, is a whole other area which we have to talk about, which is visualization versus conceptualization. But if you're thinking in words, obviously, you can only think with a complexity related to the number of words you can think in. All right, so, which is why, that 1-year-old who's a 1 is easy because they can only think in what is specifically there at the moment. And at 2, when the complexity of thought is I want or don't want, we get the tantrum behavior. All right, because they can't think in more pieces than that. They can't think, I want this, but I can get it later. There's no but I can get it later. Okay? None of that is there. None of that complexity of thought is there. And as we go up each piece, the complexity of thought gets better. The behavior gets better because the child can think through issues better. And unfortunately, one of the additional problems we have, if you go through development at a typical normal rate, part of what happens is change is the norm. And change is fast. And the brain seeks it. All right, you look at typical kids, and any parent who has a kid with any kind of neurodevelopmental issue, looks at typical kids and say, gee whiz, I spent years trying to get my child to walk, and here's little brother who, I've been kind of ignoring, and he just did it all by himself. That's not fair. And if we watch those neurotypical kids, they push themselves to the next level. And they push themselves to the next level because for their brains, change is their norm. And their brain is constantly seeking the next stage. Part of what we're dealing with our kids is staying the same is their norm. The brain is comfortable where it is. They are comfortable where they are. And they are resisting change. So we not only have to put the pieces together to get to the next level, we almost have to pull them to the next level as well.
And how do we do that?
Well, again, we have to be very cognizant of where they are. And if we understand where we are, we know what that next incremental step is. And we can target that next incremental step, and that's what we want to work at. If we're aiming 2 or 3 steps higher than where we are, we're not going to be successful. Or we're going to keep pushing and pushing and pushing, which gets ugly. Okay, or if we're too low, we're not doing any good. So the big thing is, understanding where we are and targeting that next little incremental step. And then we hit that with frequency, intensity, and duration. We focus on that. When we get that, then we take it another notch higher and focus on that and hit that with frequency, intensity, and duration.
Can you explain a little bit about the frequency, intensity, and duration?
Yeah, the basis of all of our development, all of our function is neuroplasticity. And essentially, neuroplasticity means that if we stimulate a brain, we supply the brain with specific appropriate input, and we apply that specific appropriate input with sufficient frequency, often enough intensity, strong enough, and sufficient duration over a long enough period of time, we essentially grow neural networks and connections and physically change the brain. All right, so we keep, if you will, putting in wiring to the brain. And if we're providing the right input, neuroplasticity produces positive results. Now, one of our serious issues with kids on the spectrum is that if you have abnormal sensory function, so you're perceiving things incorrectly, the brain's getting bad information. And it's getting that bad information with frequency, intensity, and duration. And guess what? We're growing bad wiring in the brain. Okay, that's obviously, a serious problem. One of my big issues with the kids on the spectrum is people understanding their stims or isms. And I don't know how many years back, I coined the term debilitating sensory addictive behaviors. Okay? Debilitating sensory addictions. And if you will, if you look at a child on the spectrum and you see them doing something over and over again that's abnormal, it's a reflection of a sensory problem. They're perceiving something incorrectly. So because they're doing it over and over again, they're triggering this negative plasticity, and if you will, making things worse. So I call it debilitating sensory addictions because, number one, it's hurting them. All right, so it's harming their development and function. It's not helping, it's debilitating. The foundation of it is sensory, debilitating sensory. And then a big word that parents have to understand is addiction. All right, these behaviors are addictions. The brain responds to these behaviors just as it would a drug. And the more you do it, the stronger the addiction becomes. And like any other addiction, if you have an addiction, your brain keeps going to the addiction. All right, people who need a drug fix aren't walking around properly involved with their world. They're walking around, their brain saying, where's my next fix? So you're trying to work with one of the kids who has a lot of debilitating sensory addictions. Their brain constantly is focused on where's my next fix? What can I shake? What can I stick in my mouth? What can I hit? All right? So we have to understand what these behaviors are and understanding that they are incredibly, incredibly harmful. And that we really need to do everything we can to redirect the kids when they're doing them. So we're decreasing the frequency, okay? And hopefully we're increasing the intensity and duration of these activities so that we're not triggering the negative neuroplasticity. At the same time, we need to be normalizing the sensory channels so that the brain doesn't get such a kick out of it. And at the same time, we need to be building the cognition so that we can give the brain a whole lot more interesting things to do than sitting there shaking something.
What I love is that, you've said in the past that it doesn't matter what age they are because, we've all heard that the window closes, and we have to catch them when they're really young, which clearly is ideal. The younger you can catch the child to find the best treatment for that child's, obviously optimal. But when you're in your program, you help children of all ages, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Children and adults of all ages. Again, the wonderful thing about, these brains we were given is as long as we're breathing, we have neuroplasticity. And as long as we're breathing, we can change the brains. And another piece that's significant, when I was talking about the base of cognition being the processing, and the processing goes typically from a 0 to about a 7, no matter when you hit those numbers, you change the global function. For example, we have a center in St. George in southern Utah, primarily for young adults with Down syndrome. And most of them come to us as adults. And some of them, we've had some, in their 50s. And the wonderful thing to see with this population is their brains respond as rapidly as the 2- and 3-year-olds' brains respond. So we're teaching adults to process, building their cognition, building their language, teaching them to read, as though they were little kids. So, when you really understand neuroplasticity in the brain, it really is never too late to produce change.
Well, I know my son is almost 14, and I know I never give up, and I always think about, I've heard the examples of those that have had strokes and lost their language and their mobility, and yet, when they figured out how to regain those skills, they end up being okay. And we just don't know enough about the brain to in my opinion, to just, I feel like a lot of people just kind of write our children off. When they hit a certain age, they say, oh, well, this is the best they're ever going to be. And what I've been so inspired about learning about your work and doing your work with my son even, is that, there is no, this is always going to be this way, or that's always going to be that way, and you find all these great tools and techniques and different ways to really, as you said, stimulate that brain with different exercises and different, kind of, I guess, our work that we do, right? Whether that be with different flashcards or different moving the body. And I think for a lot of the families that are listening right now, because they might not have ever heard of your program, because maybe they just got the diagnosis. Maybe they got the diagnosis a long time ago, and yet they are just now back on their quest looking for maybe something new to learn about. It doesn't matter if the child's 1, doesn't matter if the child's 2, doesn't matter if the child's 22 or 52. Your program is tailored to really understand the specific needs. And I can't emphasize that enough, because we're told every time you go to different conferences, not to give up hope, not to give up hope. However, with you, and kind of what our whole summit's about, is that this is hope with a plan, and what you're putting together are these great building blocks. And I know you touched a little bit on the visualization part. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. If you will, all children start off being primarily visual learners, all right? If you don't understand language, you learn from your environment by visually paying attention to it. Okay, you watch what somebody does and you try to model from that and understand what's going on from that without any words. It's a little like what you do if you're in a foreign country and you don't understand any of the language. You pay attention as much as you possibly can visually to understand what's going on. Okay, so when we take a child and we delay the development, slow down that auditory sequential processing, what happens is the children learn to learn through their eyes rather than their ears. Okay? And what happens with that is their visual processing tends to surpass their auditory processing. And if you can't think in words, which we call conceptualization, you think in pictures, which is visualization. And a typical child starts off being a visual learner, a visualizer, and then language starts kicking in, conceptual thought starts kicking in, and you end up generally with a pretty good balance between visualization and conceptualization, thinking in pictures, thinking in words. But with our kids, where the auditory is so delayed, They are much, 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 much stronger visualizers. All right, so a common kind of thing is you take one of our kids into a situation that's new, and they totally freak out. And the parent is wondering, what's going, why in the world does he do this? All right. Well, if you think about it, if you have a child who's auditory and can think in words, can think conceptually, they can listen to you. And mom is saying, oh, we're going to go to this place and do this thing, and it's going to be fun. And you understand, I'm going to go to this new place, and we're going to go have fun. If you can't process those words and think in those words, you function in life with pictures. And I've been there, I've got a picture of it. It might be a good picture and I like it. It might be a bad picture, I never want to do it again. I'm going to freak out every time you try to take me there. But if you try to take them to someplace new, it's like they're falling off a cliff because they don't have the means, the mechanism to think their way through the situation. They don't have a picture for it. Many parents discover that if they're going to do something new, to actually have photographs of where they're going and what's going to happen, or videos related to it, so the child can watch that and get a picture, they handle it much better. Yeah. So in terms of just daily life, it's tough dealing with it when you're only dealing with pictures and don't have many words. But what makes things a little tougher for us is when you're such a strong visualizer, the brain isn't trying to process the words and isn't developing the conceptualization and the cognition. So we really, really have to push all the auditory components and often limit the visual. Now, part of what happens with the visualization with a lot of our kids is perseveration. Now, perseveration means doing the same thing over and over again. And a lot of our kids who have really poor central vision will not attend to a TV. They don't see a TV. Once that central vision develops a bit, they can attend to a TV. And what a lot of our kids tend to do is want to watch the same thing over and over and over and over again. And it becomes a debilitating sensory addiction. They actually become addicted to a specific video. Or they can also do it with a specific book. But if you watch one of our kids with one of these videos that they perseverate with, you can watch their body language. And what you see happen is there are specific spots in the videos that excite them. And as you approach that spot in the video, you can see their body starting to tense up, and it's like they're ready to explode, and that event occurs, and they do explode. Okay? And what is going on is, they often memorize that video by about the third time they've seen it. And what happens is they anticipate what's going to happen because they've memorized it. And when it does happen, they get this big endorphin release and become more addicted to it. And every time they watch it, become more addicted to it and more addicted to it. And what even makes it worse is after they've seen it a few times, they don't actually need the video anymore. They've got it in their head. And Johnny's sitting there, and you're trying to teach Johnny to read, or Johnny to add, or Johnny to put his shoes on. And Johnny's not present. Johnny's not with you because Johnny is playing his video. Johnny is feeding his addiction while you're trying to teach him something. So this visualization issue is very, 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 very common. And it's a huge problem. And it's incredibly important that we build the auditory, we build the conceptual, and we, if you will, deprive the brain of all of those addictive videos and pieces. And again, generally it's visual, but the kids perseverate with sounds. They may have a app, for example, that has a specific sound that they love, so they keep going and doing that same thing over and over again on an app to produce that sound they're addicted to. So anything that the kids perseverate with or stuck on needs to go away.
Well, you mentioned being present. Like, are you talking about that they need to be attending to what you're doing? They can't be in their own world. Is that what you're talking about?
Exactly. Yeah, okay. That's being present. And, most of our parents, with kids on the spectrum, know that generally their kid's not present. If they're visualizing something, they're not generally processing something at the same time. So they kind of have either kind of a blank look on their face, or their eyes are kind of up to the side, or they're looking right through you. They're not present.
And then sometimes some of our kids are kind of present sometimes and then not present other times, especially when their favorite video or, some of the examples you gave come about into their life.
Yeah. I mean, if one of the keys, if you look at your program, frequency, intensity, and duration, right? We try to get as much intensity as we can, which means the kid is as an active participant as we can get. And part of what is significant with that is as you increase duration, you decrease intensity. And, many of the things we do with kids only have about a minute or 2 minutes of duration, and we're done, we go to something else. And that's because, we've learned that we can generally get about 2 minutes in and maintain intensity. At 2.5 minutes, we're losing the kid. At 3 minutes, we're talking to ourselves. And if we look at how things are typically done with most of our kids, the duration is long enough that it would drive you and I insane.
Oh, trust me, I've watched Jackson throughout the years, and I was like, I would get tired of you asking me the same question 5,000 times in a row, too.
It's not unusual at my office that I'll hear a scream, and I'll go see what's happening. It's one of my staff watching a video of one of our kids who's in a school situation or working with a therapist. And, they scream because it just drives them insane. It's like, how can you're working with zero intensity. You do it on and on and on and on again, and you're asking us why the kid doesn't like it and why the kid isn't progressing. Please, have some sense in terms of just the basics of how a brain develops.
Well, and I think a lot of parents that are listening can relate. I mean, I remember, just listening to throughout the many different therapies we've tried with, my son. And, I remember one time a therapist was asking him a question, and, it might have been, what is your favorite food, kind of thing. And then, she basically told him his favorite food. Let's just pretend it was carrots or whatever she decided at that moment was his favorite food. So then she would say carrots. And then he'd say carrots. And then she'd say, so what is your favorite food? And then she would tell him again to say carrots. And this went on for about, I don't even know, it felt like eternity. It was probably 30 times. And he finally took the carrot and threw it at her. And I thought to myself,
hooray, good job.
I just remember just giggling. And she gave me this look kind of like, that wasn't funny. But I'm thinking I would have thrown it at you at about 10 times asking. I thought he held his patience very well. So I think a lot of parents can relate.
Yeah, absolutely. And you just brought up a very significant point, which is, again, the brain learns through specific input. And if you watch what's happening with most of our kids in supposedly educational or therapeutic situations, it's all output. It's not showing Johnny something and saying, Johnny, this is that. It's, Johnny, what is that? And when they tell you, oh, well, what is it again? And gee, we're going to keep asking you this until you can give me the right answer with 80% consistency. most of our kids couldn't tell you their name with 80% consistency. Doesn't mean they don't know their name. It just means they can't be focused every time to do it. And the more times you ask for the output, often your odds decrease every time you do that you're going to get the right answer. And again, the only reason you ask for output is to have a sense of what's going in. But, anyone working with a child, the vast majority of the time should be spent on input.
I totally agree, and I think a lot of the families listening right now, and probably even a lot of the professionals listening right now, can relate to everything we've been talking about. I can't believe our hour is almost up. I want to definitely ask you a couple more questions. First of all, do you think we will ever have a magic pill for our kids?
No, there can't be, and I so wish parents would stop looking for one. It can't exist. If there could be a magic pill, you and I could take a magic pill and we'd know calculus tomorrow. Okay?
I would have loved that in high school.
Yeah, it doesn't, the brain doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. You cannot trigger, stimulate, cause development to occur through any specific kind of magic pill. It's a process. And you can't cheat the process. You've got to go from step 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. And you've got to do it with sufficient frequency, intensity, and duration. The right input over and over again. So, I hate seeing so many families run from this to that, to that, to that, to that, looking for that specific thing that's going to change their kid.
Well, how do you perceive the future for our children? What do you think is going to happen in the future?
I'm very positive about what can happen for any specific child given specific opportunities. And I see kids from all over the world, and it's good to see that perceptions are changing around the world. But we've got to really help the people who are working with our kids understand things better. But in the short term, parents have to get it. Parents have to assume the responsibility. Parents have to direct the show. Okay? Nobody can take the place of a parent. And until more of the professionals, more of the schools get a better handle on what is and what needs to be, our kids' lives and their futures are dependent on the parents.
Now, how can people find out more about you and the home-based programs that you help with?
They can go to NACD.org. We have lots of articles, videos, CDs, lots of information there.
And your program, just so people understand, your program is one that they end up getting a coach that ends up working with them and answering questions, and really a great support system. And you work with kids all over the world, and you help tailor these programs for each individual family and really help that family understand, really how to build that relationship and build those blocks and build all the stuff we were talking about today on this call with that child, because, I know you really believe in our kiddos, and of all ages. When I say kiddos, you could be 52 and somebody's kid still.
Yes, absolutely.
And so I want people to understand that the program that you guys run and have done for years and years and years and decades is, one that's really specialized per family, and the support system that you guys offer is something that I've actually personally never seen. I hope parents, look at your guys' site and find out more information and, just contact you guys. Now, final thoughts. What's the one thing you want to leave parents thinking about after this talk?
I think the primary thing for the parents is it's up to you. You are the greatest expert on your child. You know your child better than anyone else. Your job as a parent is to educate yourself and really understand this as much as you can. And then you act as the person who has to be in control of everything and anything that's happening to your child, with your child, for your child. You make the decisions, be an active participant, proactive. And if you really believe in the potential of your kids, and do believe in it, don't believe that because your child has this or that label that they're doomed, or to have low expectations. Believe your child can be anything given the opportunity. And your job as a parent is to see that your child has those opportunities.
So inspirational and so informative. Thank you so much, Bob, for taking the time to talk to all the families.
My pleasure. Thank you.